Germany, June 1921 to November 1923. Highest monthly inflation rate, over 30,000%. Time required for prices to double, every few days. During World War I, like many countries, Germany, then called the Weimar Republic, suspended its gold standard to fund the war effort, based on the belief that they were going to win the war and pay for it by plundering their enemies. That plan obviously didn't work out, so after the war, they were left shackled with not only their own war debts, but were also fined 132 billion gold marks in reparations by the Treaty of Versailles, the equivalent of about $269 billion today. The first payment of that war guilt came due in June 1921. The problem was the treaty didn't allow Germany to make payments in its own currency, so Germany had no choice but to exchange their German marks for other respected currencies at really bad exchange rates. So what was the solution? Well, we're off the gold standard, so let's just print more money. And print they did. That printed money was used to buy foreign currency, that foreign currency was used to pay off their war reparations, and soon Germany was buying foreign currency at any price because why not? All they had to do was print more money, so in just a little over a year later, the German mark was already practically worthless. A $50,000 bill turned into a $500,000 bill, to a $5 million bill, to a $50 million bill, to $500 million, to $5 billion, to $50 billion, to $500 billion, to $5 trillion, to a $50 trillion bill. Bills that were worth more of its weight as wood fire than as a medium of exchange. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks by the end of 1922 skyrocketed to 200 billion marks just a year later. Although Germany was the most infamous case of hyperinflation, it is far from the worst. This episode is brought to you by Trends. Learn about thousands of great business ideas that you can take advantage of long before you read about them in the Wall Street Journal. I personally enjoyed reading about the massive growth around apps popping up on Slack's platform. Who would have thought that Slack apps would grow into a $300 million market? Stay tuned to the end to learn more, or feel free to discover your next big idea right now by going to trends.co/JakeTran. Try out Trends for an entire week, all for just $1. Again, that's trends.co/JakeTran. The link is also in the video description below. Hungary, August 1945 to July 1946. Highest monthly rate of inflation, 4.19 times 10 to the 16th power, or this giant number. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 207%. Time required for prices to double, 15 hours. After World War II, like many countries, Hungary was left in shambles. Their industries were crippled, and what remained of their assets were seized by both sides of the war. So the amount of goods produced went down, but the amount of money in circulation stayed the same. So, inflation. But instead of trying to reduce the inflation by reducing the amount of money in circulation, which could have made the already dead economy worse, Hungary took a different approach. The government intentionally caused inflation by printing literally as much money as they could. What started out as 25 billion penge in July 1945 grew to 1.6 trillion penge 6 months later. Then just 4 months after that, the money supply grew to 65 quadrillion, which is a million billion. Then just another 2 months after that, to 47 septillion. That's 47 trillion trillion. To make this a little bit more comprehensible, something that cost 379 penge in September 1945 went up to a trillion 10 months later. At one point, the government had to stop collecting taxes, because if they were late by just 1 day, it would have wiped out the value of the taxes the government collected. Needless to say, this would go down in history as the worst case of hyperinflation ever. Yugoslavia, April 1992 to January 1994. Highest monthly inflation rate, 313 million%. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 64.6%. Time required for prices to double, 1.4 days. Yugoslavia was a nation born in the wake of World War II that was made up of these modern-day countries. During the early days of the breakup of these nation-states in the early 1990s, the second worst case of hyperinflation occurred. Far worse than the Weimar Republic, yet it seems to have slipped under the public's consciousness. At its peak in January 1994, the official monthly inflation rate was 313 million%, or 4 times higher than the Weimar Republic, and the results were devastating. People's income dropped more than 50%, they couldn't afford food if there was any to be bought, bread lines formed, gas stations were closed, foreign exchange black markets emerged. To put it into perspective, imagine the money you have in your bank account right now, then imagine moving the decimal point 22 places to the left. Then imagine trying to buy something. Then imagine trying to survive through this for 2 years straight, from the start of 2020 to the end of 2021 for example. Zimbabwe, March 2007 to November 2008. Highest monthly inflation rate, 79.6 billion%. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 98%. Time required for prices to double, 24.7 hours. After Zimbabwe gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1980, this opened up a whole new profession: politicians. Politicians whose first priority has always been to secure those votes, to secure their seat in power. And how do you secure that public support as a politician who has control over the government spending? Offer free stuff. So offer free stuff they did, which created a spending problem for their government. Add on top of that a ton of other stuff like the government seizing farms from white farmers and giving it to black farmers that didn't know how to farm, which created a food shortage.
The situation was made worse by costly participation in the Congo War in 1998 and sanctions against Robert Mugabe's government in 2002.
The government blames its financial problems on sanctions imposed by the EU and US during Mugabe's reign.
The banking sector collapsing and the money printer going burr, and you have the perfect storm to nurture some hyperinflation. The general rule of thumb is that hyperinflation is when the monthly inflation rate is above 50%, and since 1998, Zimbabwe has been hovering around a 50% annual inflation rate. Mix in Zimbabwe's central bank continuing to tinker with the economy to try to slow down inflation, and by March 2007, the country was experiencing full-blown hyperinflation, with again a peaking around 79.6 billion% a month.
Prices in shops would go up several times a day, water and power cuts happened often, and there were queues at banks, petrol stations, and severe shortages of food in supermarkets.
A problem they're still struggling on and off with to this day.
This year, inflation is hovering at around 300%. That was the latest figure before Zimbabwe's finance minister put a moratorium on publishing numbers.